Hello, welcome to the Wildline podcast. I'm your host, Dan. This is a podcast about movies and how much money they make at the box office. Today is a little bit of a special day. Normally during the week, I'll do a preview show for the new releases that are coming out. It just so happens that this weekend is like the biggest movie ever. Star Wars The Last Jedi is opening tomorrow. And so I wanted to do a special episode just dedicated to what I think it's going to do, what it means in the history of Star Wars. I won't get too nerdy this episode and sort of Star Wars trivia or talking about the canon. I'm going to stick to the numbers. But I do think it's an important enough film where we sort of have to take a step back and think about how big is this thing going to be and what does that mean? The level of buzz going into this weekend is astronomical. It feels almost as if, 10, 20 years ago, this level of buzz would happen for a summer release. Right, it was always during May or June when the biggest movie of the years were coming out, or maybe July. I feel like July's gotten less and less important recently. That level of just like everybody's got to see this movie, everybody's talking about it for like the 2 weeks beforehand. Star Wars, ever since it put its flagpole in December, has now sort of taken over that sort of level of buzz and that time period where people are just so hyped to go and see movies. It's now December. It feels kind of weird. It's now essentially Christmas time. It's not that Christmas time hasn't always been a time for movies. It's just never been sort of the tentpole blockbuster moment like it started with The Force Awakens in 2015. It's become something completely new over the last few years thanks to Star Wars. So what we're going to do is this. We're going to talk a little bit about Star Wars in general and where it's been over the last 20 years. We'll talk about the biggest records that are out there because we're already assuming it's going to break over 200, I think is the assumption. That's what tracking is saying right now, at least 200. And we'll try and pinpoint where we think this is going to land. Is it going to match The Force Awakens? Does it have a chance to break Force Awakens' outrageous record for opening weekend? And also, where does it go from there? Is it gonna have long legs, short legs? Is it gonna be Rogue One, where it's sort of very well received, but did not do well in terms of box office relative to Force Awakens? Right? Is it gonna drop 43% like Rogue One did? Obviously, probably not. But it's worth discussing and where it sort of fits in the overall franchise and the Star Wars canon. So let's just take a brief little walk down Star Wars lane. I'm not going to talk about the originals. There's no reason to. Everybody's seen them a million times. They've been re-released in theaters 100,000 times. So there's no reason to walk down that path anymore. But I will talk a little bit about the prequels, Star Wars 1, 2, and 3. So Star Wars 1, Phantom Menace, and I was very much into the box office when these movies were announced. It would have been the late 90s. And, it's also hard to quantify. Like, we all know right now what it felt like with The Force Awakens buzz. It was totally special, and, like, it felt kind of surreal how excited people were to see this new Star Wars movie. There was somewhat similar of a feeling back when The Phantom Menace was coming out in 99, came out on May 19th, 1999. I remember going to see it opening weekend to a sold out house. I wasn't even that big of a Star Wars fan. I wasn't like a Star Wars nerd or anything like that, but I certainly loved the originals, especially Empire. And, I was super excited. I was probably 14 years old back then. And so I was definitely in that movie geek nerd age bracket. So I went to go see it, and like almost immediately when I got out of it and you talked to my high school friends, and the reaction was super negative kind of right away. I was like, did we just see that? Did that just happen? And so it wasn't a good sort of tons of hype, but like that balloon got popped pretty immediately right in May of 1999. But let's just walk through the financials and see how each prequel did. And then we'll talk about leading into the new sort of series of Star Wars films. So Star Wars Episode 1, Phantom Menace, opened in 99. I wanted to adjust these for 2017 But Box Office Mojo is sort of blowing up right now, so I can't do that. So I'm only going to talk in the real dollars that were spent back then. So keep in mind these are probably inflated up a lot from what these are, but it'll give us sort of a ballpark of how these films did. So Phantom Menace opened at 64 in May '99. It ended up at 431. Pretty much fantastic across the board. No real complaints there. That's a really high multiplier. I don't remember the multiplier being that crazy high. And a lot of that came from 6.7 multiplier. What? That makes zero sense. How is that even possible? Maybe they... no, that's right. 6.7 multiplier. I can't even imagine that. I don't remember people going back and seeing it over and over again, but that's what people did, right? So very good performance. Opening weekend wise, great. Maybe they thought I was going to go a little bit higher than that, but you can't beat that 6.7 multiplier. That probably is the biggest multiplier ever, or at least in the top 5 for a super wide release like this. Like I can't think of anything else maybe besides Titanic doesn't really count. Maybe Force Awakens comes close. Let's see. Force Awakens had a multiplier of 247. Not even close. Yeah. Way below that. 3.7 was the multiplier for Force Awakens. So Phantom Menace opens a little bit lower than they thought, but ends up having a fantastic multiplier and makes $431 million total. Again, these are not adjusted. Attack of the Clones comes out May of 2002, so 3 years later. Opens higher at 80, closes down lower at 300. And by that time, the negative criticisms of the prequels became pretty set in stone. And then 3 years later, you have Star Wars Episode 3, Revenge of the Sith. Let's see, May 19th, 2005, opens at 108, so the opening weekend gets even higher, and just 380. Revenge of the Sith is universally claimed as the best prequel. That's absolutely true. The other two prequels are insanely messy and have not a very good story, to be honest with you. Revenge of the Sith makes sense, and it's a pretty decent movie overall, even if you throw out the Star Wars mythology stuff to it. It's a good movie. So, by 2005, you have the 3 prequels out, you have the 3 originals. The prequels, I don't think financially very successful, but critically very much panned. And that got worse and worse as that decade wore on from 2005 onward. By 2008, 2009, the prequels were just considered a complete another joke. So I think a lot of people never even considered that Star Wars would be revitalized or there would be a reboot of it. It just didn't seem like it was going to happen. Just because of the critical and sort of popular opinion of the prequels. They weren't good. They weren't anywhere near the originals, not even close to the genius and grandiosity of the originals. The prequels did not have that in them whatsoever. So when Disney bought LucasArts and bought the Star Wars sort of IP, intellectual property, people got really excited again, right? And there was a ton of hype for at least 4 years before The Force Awakens. I can't even remember when they bought it, but it felt like it was 3 to 4 years before Force Awakens came out that there was this buzz building. Okay, like Disney's got control of this. It's going to be amazing. Who's going to direct it? J.J. Abrams. Oh my God, that's a perfect choice. And this hype just kept building and building and building. And by the time we got to Force Awakens, it felt like we were getting the movies that we all wanted after Return of the Jedi left the theaters in 1983, right? So it felt like there's this 32-year gap until we got the continuation of that story, not just in the canon of Star Wars, because Star Wars The Force Awakens is episode 7, right? It is an actual continuation of Return of the Jedi. But on a deeper level, it felt like spiritually and quality-wise that these new Star Wars films would be the true torchbearer of the originals. Whereas the prequels felt like this very sort of weird side path that the mythology and canon took, that George Lucas sort of took us all down. We're like, what the freak is this? Like, this is a total mess. It makes no sense. These characters are absurd. The overall story, I don't know, probably makes sense on some level, but for most of us was just like, I don't even care. If you want to hear the best take on why the prequels suck, listen to Patton Oswalt's routine about how if he had a time machine, he wouldn't go back and kill Hitler. He'd go back and hit George Lucas over the head with a shovel, so he wouldn't be able to make the prequels. I believe it's on his 2007 Werewolves and Lollipops comedy album, if you're looking for something to laugh at. Hilarious routine, but really hits the point that, like, it, we really love Darth Vader. We love these certain characters. We don't really care where they came from or their sort of origin stories. That was his point. I don't know how true that is, because if you look at the comic book movie phenomenon, like, every one of those movies is an origin story, and most of them are very successful. But it's a really funny routine that does. So in any event, Force Awakens, coming out in December 2015, feels like a real continuation of those 3 original films. And it feels like it's part of that mythology in a very deep way, which the prequels felt like they just weren't. And so the buzz coming into Force Awakens was probably the biggest buzz I've ever seen for a movie ever since I've been following the box office. Nothing really comes close to how much people were interested in it. And it wasn't just the level of passion, it was the breadth of it. Like, it was across the board, men, women, didn't matter what age they were. Everybody was invested in it. And you kind of have to keep in mind, like, the people who saw the original Star Wars in theaters, they probably have kids or even grandkids by this point, right? So it's like, for a cross-generational sort of event and moment in terms of the box office and movies and culture. And the opening weekend of The Force Awakens reflects that. It did 247. This is December of 2015, 2 years ago. 247, basically $248 million on its opening weekend, with a per theater average, which we'll dive into a little bit later here, if I can find it, and it's gone, almost $60,000 per theater that weekend. The previous record had been Jurassic World that year with $48,900 per theater. So it basically decimated every possible record that had stood. Going into that weekend amongst the box office nerds, because this was not that long ago, and there's a pretty there's always been an active box office nerd community online, but it's gotten really sort of a lot bigger of a group recently. So there are a ton of people that were throwing out guesses for Force Awakens. Very, very few thought that it was going to break even Jurassic World's record, which was set earlier that year. Very few people. I was one of the few people who thought that, like, this is going to go way past 220, 230. This is going to go into the 240s. Of all the people that I read, there's almost nobody who was saying that. The reason I said that is I looked at, like, per theater averages and took a really deep dive into it, and then you took into consideration that, like, they're adding screenings for 24/7 screenings. So in, like, places like New York, there was a 3 a.m. screening, a 6 a.m. screening. That's just super, super abnormal, and those things were, like, selling out. So what that tells you is the normal sort of rules of per theater averages were going to be thrown out the window. Because when you're doubling the number of screenings per screen, then that's going to send that per theater average to the roof. So when it did open at 247, everybody was super excited. It felt like the result definitely matched the hype. And then, of course, the movie goes on to almost do $1 billion just domestically. Does $936 million in the U.S. and Canada. With like a 3.7 multiplier. So not only does it, like, break every opening weekend record, but it also has a fantastic multiplier because people really loved the film. Now there was a little bit of backlash later after the film had been out for a while, specifically through South Park and their whole whatever season that was storyline about member berries and how J.J. Abrams ruined Star Wars and stuff like this. Kind of a funny plot line, but, like, looking back on it, the biggest critique of Star Wars, Force Awakens, was that it felt like a direct copy of A New Hope. Right? Like it just did not seem like it was really doing anything all that new. And I think for most people, including myself, like that was fine when I saw it in the theater. Actually, I saw it 3 times in the theater. By the time I got to home video, I guess like 8 months later, it was like, okay, like Force Awakens is on, cool. But it's just like, yeah, I just didn't really want to sit there and watch it. And to be honest with you, I will watch a lot of things just in passing. I have the TV on while I work. I work from home. And so my sort of threshold for interest isn't really all that high. Like I'll sit there and have like any number of sort of mediocre movies on, but I'll still watch them because they're engaging. The Force Awakens, I don't know if it was just like it's too bombastic or too much. It just on repeated viewings, it never really drew me back into it. Although the first and second times I saw it in the theaters were fantastic experiences overall. You got a big crowd, everybody's super excited. It's just a really fun time. And so, part of the relaunch of Star Wars was they're not only going to do these mainline films like The Force Awakens and now The Last Jedi, they're also going to do these side films on the off years. So we had Rogue One, a Star Wars story, last year open up on basically the same weekend as Force Awakens, and it's the second weekend in December here. Rogue One, going into that weekend, people were thinking, oh wow, like if Force Awakens did 247, then Rogue One's got to do like 180, 190, right? At least it's not part of the main series, but like it's it sort of fits into the rest of the canon pretty well. It's Disney. This they hit a grand slam with The Force Awakens. It ended up opening at 155, I think, to a lot of people's disappointment. But it ended up doing 532, which wasn't bad by any stretch of imagination. 3.4 multiplier. I think when you looked at it compared to Force Awakens, maybe disappointing. But if you look at it just as a movie on its own, huge success, unbelievable success when you think about it. Just the production budget and probably the marketing spent on it. They easily printed, I don't know, 152, probably well over $200 million in profit. Deadline has that listed somewhere. I haven't looked it up though. So huge success, another huge success, and not even sort of the mainline films. So what we have now, that sort of brings us a little bit to where we are now. You had the originals are absolute classics, huge blockbusters. They're icons in the box office and the movie world, of course. The prequels financially did very, very well for Fox, but culturally and critically, just were not received in a way that made them very endearing. Right? Like if you ask most people about the prequels, of course there's the whole prequel meme thing going on with people like under 30 and like in their mid 20s and younger. That is an interesting phenomenon that I clearly don't understand because I'm in my mid 30s and like I don't understand what they're talking about with the prequel memes. I've tried to dive in multiple times. I just don't get it. So there's that thing going on, but ultimately critically and I think mass culturally we view them as very poor movies and products. Not the case with Force Awakens and Rogue One. Like they received very, very well. People love them. They made enormous amounts of money, and they've been just huge successes all around, critically, culturally, and financially. Right. So that sort of leads us into The Last Jedi. Now we had a pretty significant drop from Rogue One from The Force Awakens. I think it was like 43%. That's pretty massive when you think about it, right? Coming into this weekend, if we try to put this in context of what's been happening this year in movies, we had a very strong early part of the year, right? We were up like, I can't remember off the top of my head, but maybe $200 million after March. Really strong performance. That's much bigger than inflation would do, I think, maybe. Yeah, obviously. And so it was very strong. Summer started pretty strong too, with Wonder Woman doing well. And then July, things sort of take a turn, although Dunkirk does well. Movies like Transformers and Pirates just sort of collapse. And by the time we get to August, the box office essentially crashes. And I think it lost what, 500 million? No, I think it lost $800 million in August, or sort of lost its pace versus last year. Last year was like a record-breaking box office year, but it just, things did not go well in August. And September we had It, so that was a huge breakthrough and a big surprise to a lot of people. Everybody thought it was going to do well, but no one thought it was going to do that well. So September was great. October was kind of a bust. Blade Runner was supposed to carry that month, and it ended up being a pretty big dud. But then November sort of picked it up a little bit, and let's see where we're at yearly right now in terms of just maybe a percentage, to see how much we're still off. Still off about 4%. That's a pretty significant amount of money. Like, that's not a small amount. So the box office is definitely down. There's I've talked about this a lot on the podcast as to why this is happening. A lot of it has to do with, my theory here is that, misscheduling. That sounds kind of like a lame excuse, like things are scheduled wrong. But go back and look at August and see what happened. Like, nothing major came out. No tentpole blockbusters came out, and they should have. Things were really crowded in July. They needed to spread them out more. There's just sort of like some missteps by the studios. Also, these massive film franchises have failed, like Aliens, Transformers, and Pirates just this year alone. Basically hit a brick wall. So the stuff that was working before isn't working anymore. The competition from prestige TV and subscription video on demand like Netflix, HBO Now, and Hulu, there's like millions of them now, right? I think 70 subscription VOD services started in 2017. So massive competition from home entertainment, right? Just a lot of things converging here to make it a really tough year at the box office. So a lot of studio heads are really excited that Star Wars is opening, so maybe it can sort of resuscitate this year. It's not going to catch up to last year. Like, there's a Deadline put up an article saying, is Star Wars going to is going to help bridge that gap? There's no fucking way. Like, the losses are so massive right now. Star Wars could like do double what Force Awakens did, and it still wouldn't make it that much of a difference. That's how far things are down. And so I think overall what I'm trying to say, it's been kind of an off year, right? It hasn't been a bellwether year for the box office. It's struggled a bit. There certainly have been some great stories. I'm thinking like Get Out, Split, Beauty and the Beast, hell, even recently Wonder, Hidden Figures. There are definitely hero stories or winners to point out, right? But overall, the box office is depressed, and it is a severe, significant problem for the industry that I don't think they have wrapped their head around yet. But Star Wars is approaching, and I don't think it's going to be depressed that much because of these sort of systemic or macro problems with the box office. I think, if anything, the fact that the box office has been so down and people haven't been that hyped about going to the theater, that almost helps The Last Jedi a little bit more, because it creates an event where people feel like they need to go see it in the theater. But before we get to what we think The Last Jedi is going to do, let's just take a brief walk through the biggest openings of all time. I'll just walk through the top 5 real quickly. Number 5, Captain America Civil War, 2016, opened at 179, ended up at 408. Avengers Age of Ultron, this would have been May 2015, opened at 191, closed out at 459. Marvel The Avengers, the sort of movie that broke all the records and changed our entire conception of comic book movies, May 2012, opened at 207, the first movie ever to open over 200. Closed out at 623. And then Jurassic World, of course, 2 years ago, opened at 208. To everybody's surprise, tracking had it at like 130, 150. Crazy overperformance. Jurassic World closed out at 652. The trailer for the new one is terrible, by the way. It looks awful. I don't think it's even going to break 150, to be honest with you. And then, of course, number 1, Star Wars Force Awakens, does 247, closes out at 936. just 2 years ago. So the question is like, where do we think The Last Jedi is going to fit? I've done a lot of context, a lot of holistic analysis. It's kind of a down year at the box office, but I don't think it's going to affect Last Jedi that much. Is it going to break? Is it going to be in the top 5? I would say almost definitely. There's no reason for me to believe that this will drop below 179, that Captain America Civil War level. I just don't think that that's even possible. It's certainly possible. I don't think it's likely at all. Is it going to break the 200 barrier? Is it going to get into the Age of Ultron's, the Avengers, Jurassic World range? I would say almost certainly yes. There's no reason for me to think that it won't be viewed by the general public as a continuation of the Force Awakens story. I don't think they view it as, oh, hey, this is just like Rogue One or connected to Rogue One. Rogue One felt distinctly different than the mainline Star Wars films. And so I think people are seeing it much more like the Force Awakens. Now, is it going to have the same hype as Force Awakens? Absolutely not. The Force Awakens had the most hype ever of any movie, probably since the original Star Wars, probably since Jaws. Like, we're talking 30, 40 years, that pinnacle Mount Everest of an event. Like, there's no way The Last Jedi has the same buzz as that movie. But I don't think it's that far off where it's going to be sort of going head to head with the Avengers, Ultron, or even Jurassic World. I think it's going to bump past that 210 line, which is crazy when you think about it. And all the top 5 movies I just talked about, they've all opened in the last 4 years. Or, sorry, 5 years, technically. So what does that tell you about the box office in general? Despite the fact that, they're making more money, attendance has been going down pretty significantly since 2002. Movie theaters are just making more money per ticket by increasing ticket prices because of 3D, adding services, right? So they're increasing the number they're getting out of every visit, but the number of visits is still going down and will continue to go down. At some point, it'll hit a bottom and I think even out, but not anytime soon. So it's interesting to see that all of the recent box office records were in the last few years. It basically suggests that the highs are getting higher, if you will, right? And I think in some ways the lows are getting lower. The flops are getting more severe, but the wins are just getting so massive. The average person only goes to 4 movies a year. That's sort of, if you go to movies at all in the theater, about 4 to 5 movies a year. So these winners here are one of those 4 to 5 movies that everybody wanted to see, right? And the question is, how many people really want to see The Last Jedi? I think the only real way to get an accurate sort of guesstimate on how well The Last Jedi is going to do is to take a look at per theater averages. If you don't look at per theater averages and the number of screens or theaters that it's going to be in, you're kind of just shooting into the dark. Because if you don't have one of those inputs, you're not going to be able to guess very well. So The Last Jedi is opening on 1,175 theaters. It's hard. I misspeak constantly about theaters and screens. It's hard because a lot of the times in analysis, they get confused. A theater is not a screen, right? 4,175 theaters, they're going to have a lot of screens. I wish I had a per screen number because it would be so much more accurate and more applicable and easier to use to predict other films, but I don't have that number. I don't know if that number even exists anywhere. But it is opening in 4,175 theaters on who knows how many screens and who knows how many showings. The real key metric that would be amazing is a per showing amount of money. Per earnings per showing would be amazing, but it doesn't exist. All we have is per theater average. So we're going to use that. 4,175 theaters. That is similar to what Rogue One did. Rogue One had 4,157. Force Awakens had 4,134. So it's in that realm. It's not super high. It's not over 4,200 or 4,300 like the Avengers was, or even 4,400 like the Dark Knight Rises. So it's going to be a little bit depressed because of that. I'm not sure why that is. There hasn't been anything open in the last 2 weeks. There was some crazy mafioso racketeering scheme that Disney forced on people showing this movie, like Regal, AMC, and Cinemark. I believe they said that the studio gets like 70% of the ticket sales. Normally it's 50%. But I think for Star Wars and maybe even Coco, Disney really put their foot on the movie theater's throats and said, we're going to need more money out of you. Neither here nor there. That's a whole other part of the business that I don't necessarily want to get into right now. But, it's just to put that in context. Like, that's how big this movie is. It is so special that Disney is rewriting their contracts with the movie theaters. So this thing's massive. Before we even get to a guess of a number, it's important to think about, like, is this movie good or not? Like, I know with Star Wars, it kind of feels like it wouldn't matter, right? Like, people are going to see it no matter what. But I think the positive reaction critically to Force Awakens really helped it with its buzz. And the same with Rogue One, which I thought personally was a masterpiece. I thought Rogue One was probably the best blockbuster I've seen artistically. I don't know, 10 years maybe. A lot of people did not agree with me at all about that. I thought it was wonderfully written and really a heartbreaking story at the end of the day. I guess if you don't know the canon that much, and I had no idea how that movie was going to end, I was blown away by it. I was like, wait, what? Did it just end the way that I thought it did? Like, no way. This is the Disney Star Wars movie. You can't do that. I won't give away a spoiler, but I thought it was fantastic. So, like, the critical response to these films is important, and it helps build hype. And more than anything, it's an indicator of high quality, entertaining movies. That helps the legs more than anything. That word of mouth that, like, hey, this is actually a really good movie. You should go see it. And wow, I really enjoyed that. I'm a Star Wars fan. I'm going to see it again. I mean, I saw Force Awakens 3 times. I saw Rogue One 3 times. And I'm not a huge Star Wars fan, if that tells you any indication of, like, how hyped and interesting these films are. So, where's The Last Jedi sitting right now? The initial social media reactions were ecstatic whenever that embargo got lifted, like 3 or 4 days ago or something like that. The initial responses were off the charts. Now, you cannot trust social media reactions right away. They said the same thing about Justice League, and that turned out to be one of the worst films of the year, hands down. So you got to throw those out completely. The social media stuff is bullshit. The moment that real paid critics start writing about it, like Variety, Hollywood Reporter, New York Times, San Francisco Chronicle, any of the more traditional publications, the moment they start putting out reviews, that's when I start paying attention. Because those are, I would say, they're not objective reviews, they have integrity. Whereas social media reactions just have zero integrity. And so the film's already been reviewed by 193 critics. It sits at 94% on Rotten Tomatoes. 94%. That's really good. For a movie this big, that's freaking amazing. Top critics have it at 95%. I didn't get a chance to look up Metacritic, so I'm gonna look it up right now. But the overall message here is that, okay, Last Jedi is really good. Like, someone mentioned it somewhere. It's the Dark Knight of this new series of Star Wars films, which I think is like, you don't really have a higher praise than that. It's not even possible. 85 score on Metacritic. Remember, it's totally different. 85 means they're actually giving it an 85 out of 100, which is very, very high. Incredibly high for a blockbuster film. So as of right now, the critical praise is outstanding for this film. Apparently it is very, very good. That tells me that word of mouth is going to be off the charts. It also tells me that opening weekend is going to get a pretty significant bump from where I maybe thought it was going to be a week or 2 weeks ago. Okay, so let's dive into some numbers and let's make a choice here. Also, I would like to note that, Rian Johnson, the director of this, just got greenlit to do a whole TV series. And I think it's going to be on Disney's streaming service whenever that launches, I think next year. But I think it's interesting just to look at Rian Johnson real quick. Like, here he is basically directing the biggest movie ever, right? Maybe Force Awakens will end up being bigger. Um, but as such, for all intents and purposes, this is the biggest movie in the world right now. This guy has only made 3 other films, right? And I think all 3 of them are sort of art house films. At least the first 2 are art house films. His first movie was Brick in 2016, which I think when it first came out, I hated it. This was like a true college art house film to go see. I was out of college at this time, but like whatever, I went to go see it. You know what I mean? Really interesting film, very well done. I went back and revisited it a few years ago or a couple years ago, and I was like, oh fuck, like this is actually really good. And I didn't see it back then because I was too, I don't know, whatever I was doing. I was teaching high school back then. My mind was lost in another world. I didn't get it back then, but then when I revisited it, I was like, wow, there's a talent here. There's a real specific talent. And then Brothers Bloom came out 3 years after that. That's one of those movies that just completely got ignored. I don't remember. I didn't even see it in a theater. It was definitely an art house film from Summit. I don't even know if Summit exists anymore. Really strange film. If you ever have a chance to see it, please do. I can't say say that it's amazing or fantastic. What I can say is that it is one of the most unique films I've seen in a long time. Just has a vibe to it that is really hard to pin down. It feels more a product of the 1970s than it does of now. It's so hard to explain. It's such a weird, mysterious film. Is it amazing? I don't know if it's amazing, but it's so interesting that it kind of feels amazing. And then he did Looper, which is sort of it did okay, opened at 20, ended at 66. Not a massive film by any stretch of imagination. That was only in 2012. This is his first movie in 5 years, by the way. That one sort of, I think, led him to Last Jedi more than the other 2. The other 2 showed that he could really write good characters. I think Looper proved that he could do a sort of action sci-fi movie really well. And so now he's on The Last Jedi. It blows my mind that these people... I know this guy sort of for the last decade, watching him sort of, kind of rise up a bit. I never expected he would be doing the new Star Wars movie. Like, I wouldn't bet you... I bet you $1 million he wasn't. But the same thing with Colin, what's his name? The Star Wars people wanted to branch out and get new people. That sort of backfired with them a couple of times, but at least with Colin and the Lord Miller guys from the Lego fame, those guys ended up getting fired because of creative differences. I think like to make a Star Wars movie, you have to walk this tightrope of I want to put my stamp on it, but also respect the canon of Star Wars, but more importantly, respect the business interests of Disney and Star Wars. And you kind of have to do both. And I think a lot of creative types just aren't willing to make that sort of. They aren't willing to balance those two. They really want to put their mark on it, and that's important to them. But you also have to sort of kiss the ring, which J.J. Abrams really understood, I think, which is why he did so well with Force Awakens. I think Rian Johnson, for all intents and purposes, did the same thing with The Last Jedi. Okay, enough preamble bullshit. Let's talk about what this thing's going to do. Per theater average wise, I don't think it's going to do 59, almost 60 like The Force Awakens. I don't see it happening. I just don't see it happening. The hype for that one was just off the charts, way too good. Below that is Jurassic World, which did $48,855 per theater. It was also on more theaters. I feel like it has more hype than that, more excitement. It's going to have more showings and more screens dedicated to it. So I do think it's going to go above that $48,000 per theater average. I think it's going to go above 49. I think it's going to break into the 50s. Now, how much in the 50s does it get to? I am thinking that 52, 53-ish, almost like low 53,000 per theater average. Let's just put in 53,250. And then obviously you multiply that by the number of theaters, 4,175. That puts us at $22 million essentially. I'm sorry, $222 million. 22 million. That would be like the Justice League opening. Ouch. $222 million. God, that feels right on the money. That feels like exactly what I was gonna guess. It's a huge, massive opening. Second biggest opening ever, but it doesn't really come that close to Force Awakens, which it would do if Last Jedi does do 22. That's still $25 million short on its opening weekend from Force Awakens. That feels about right. Now, there's a lot of possibilities here. There's a possibility that it just doesn't. I mean, if we're looking at Rogue One, we should be looking sub 200, right? Because you're thinking if that's a pattern, then people might think that Star Wars is saturated. It's no longer what it was 2 years ago. It feels different. There's too much content with it. Oh my God, there's a TV series coming. Just stop, right? Like, I can understand that sentiment. And we have a new we have a new Star Wars movie coming out next May. 6 months from now, there's a new Star Wars movie opening. What the fuck is going on? Not even 6 months, like 5 months. I think it's actually 6 months though, if you think about it. And it's also in 3D. And that movie's going to be a shit show. I think everybody knows that. So, and then after that, it's less than 2 years until Star Wars Episode 9 comes out. So what do we think? I'm thinking the $222 million feels exactly on the money. I really do. But deep down in my gut, I get this inkling that it could go lower than this. And so my official estimate is going to be $222 million. But I'm going to sort of do my Catholic doubt estimate. Maybe it goes below $48,000 per theater. Is that possible? Maybe it goes more like an Ultron, $45,000. What would that put it at? Just being curious. I don't know if this is even remotely possible. $187 million. My gut, deep down in my gut, my Catholic doubt says, I think it's going to do less than 200. That's what it says. But I have to push that away for my more positive, side that isn't filled with doubt and dread. And I'm going to say it's going to do $222 million for The Last Jedi. So what I'll do, that's all I really want to talk about this episode. That's my official guess, is $222 million for the Star Wars Last Jedi. It's opening weekend domestically. Tracking says 200, so I'm a good 20 million above that. Internationally, who knows what's going to do? I don't want to get into that. It's way too complicated. There's too many things, too many variables to consider. Look, I'm looking at my local showings right now. There's like, at my Podunk Theater right down the street, there's like 10 showings tomorrow, starting at 7. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. There's 11 showings at my little shit theater here from 7 p.m. onward all the way through like midnight. Like, and I'm in the middle of nowhere, Tennessee. So like, that just gives you a sort of a feeling of how popular and massive the hype is for this film. But I'm sticking with my 222. I'm thinking the tracking's a little bit low on this. I think it's not really capturing the hype. I don't think it's going to get anywhere near Force Awakens. I just don't think that that's possible. Any event, I'm going to come back on hopefully Sunday. I'm going to do a little bit of a weekend review. We'll talk about how well Star Wars did, if it really took off, if it didn't. If it didn't, then why? What the hell happened? And if it goes higher than Force Awakens, what the fuck happened? So we'll talk about that on Sunday. Thanks for listening, guys. This has been the Wildline Podcast.